Why did God's own followers need councils, votes, and centuries of debate to define what they supposedly learned straight from Jesus? If you're a Christian, you probably think the basics of your faith have always been there. The Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, the idea that Old Testament laws are absolute until they're not, the virgin birth of Jesus. But here's what I can't wrap my head around. If Jesus himself taught these things and his followers believed them right from the start, why did it take the church decades or even centuries to figure them out? If something is so central, why did they have to hold votes at councils to settle it? Why were people still fighting over it long after Jesus was dead and buried, or resurrected? Why does the religion that claims to come straight from the mouth of God look like something patched together over centuries? Let's start with the Trinity, because it's the identity of God himself, the very core of Christianity. Christianity teaches that there is one God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This isn't a side issue or a minor detail, it's the fundamental nature of the divine, and yet it took centuries for the church to agree on this. The concept of the Trinity emerges gradually in the New Testament, with Jesus frequently referring to God as his Father and to the Holy Spirit. But the specific doctrine of three co-equal, co-eternal persons in one Godhead wasn't clearly spelled out until the 4th century. Before that, there were all kinds of debates and disagreements. Some early Christians, like the Arians, believed that Jesus was a divine but created being, subordinate to the Father. Others, like the modalists, saw the Father, Son, and Spirit not as distinct persons, but as different modes or manifestations of the one God. It wasn't until the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE that the Church definitively declared Jesus to be of the same substance as the Father, and the Council of Constantinople in 381 CE that the full Trinity as we know it was affirmed. Even after that, the doctrine continued to be a source of controversy and schism. The Eastern and Western branches of Christianity split, partly over disagreements about the precise relationship between the three persons. The Spanish king Recared had to convene a council in 589 CE to settle an argument over whether the Holy Spirit proceeded from both the Father and the Son, or just the Father. So how can something so central take centuries to define? Wouldn't you expect the followers of an all-knowing God to have this nailed down from the start? If Jesus was the Son of God, and he taught his disciples about the Trinity, why was there such profound uncertainty and debate for so long? The reason is that the core Christian doctrines aren't actually laid out in a clear, unambiguous way in the Bible. The New Testament contains hints and suggestions of the Trinity, but no definitive statement. The specific formulation had to be pieced together over time through interpretation, debate, and ultimately imperial power. This is true not just of the Trinity, but of many of the supposedly bedrock tenets of Christianity. Take the Old Testament law, for example. Jesus clearly said he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And yet, Christians from the very beginning struggled with how to apply Mosaic law. Do we need to follow all 613 commandments? What about the dietary restrictions or the requirement to stone adulterers? Paul insisted that Gentile converts didn't need to be circumcised or follow Jewish law. But other early Christians, like the Judaizers, insisted that the law was still binding. It took major councils and heated arguments before the church could agree on which Old Testament laws were still in force. Even the divinity of Jesus, which seems like such a foundational Christian belief, wasn't a settled matter for centuries. Some early Christians, like the Ebionites, saw Jesus as a purely human Messiah, not divine at all. Arius and his followers believed that Jesus was a created being, subordinate to the Father. It wasn't until the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE that the Church officially declared Jesus to be of the same substance as God. The virgin birth, another core Christian belief, also wasn't universally accepted in the early centuries. Some early Christians believed that Mary was a regular woman who had normal conjugal relations with Joseph. It wasn't until the 4th century that the dogma of the virgin birth was firmly established. So the picture that emerges is one of a religion that was very much a work in progress, with its most fundamental tenets slowly coalescing over centuries of debate, disagreement, and political maneuvering. The Bible itself is not a clear, unambiguous source of Christian doctrine. It's a complex, sometimes contradictory collection of texts that required extensive interpretation, and that interpretation was shaped by the historical and cultural context of the Church as it grew and evolved. Ultimately, what settled these theological disputes wasn't just scholarly debate, but the exercise of political power. When the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in the 4th century, he threw the full weight of the imperial state behind the Trinitarian faction. Those who dissented, like the Arians, were declared heretics and often suffered violent persecution. The same was true of other key Christian doctrines. The Council of Nicaea, which affirmed the divinity of Christ, was convened and enforced by the emperor. Later councils that solidified the doctrine of the Trinity and other beliefs were similarly backed by imperial power. Though the God-given truths of Christianity were in fact hammered out through a messy, protracted political process, with winners and losers, power struggles and purges. Theological positions that seem fundamental to us now were once hotly contested, with Christians fighting bitterly over them, and the ultimate arbiter was not reason or divine revelation, but the sword of the state. This stands in stark contrast to the common Christian belief that the core of their faith was simply handed down from on high, unchanged and uncontested since the time of Jesus. The reality is that Christianity, like any human institution, evolved and adapted over time, with its leaders constantly having to referee disputes and make decisions about what should be considered orthodox. So when we look at the history of how Christianity defined its most basic tenets, we see a process that is decidedly undivine, a messy, contingent political struggle to establish dogma, often through the use of force. It's a story that should give any believer pause and prompt questions about how much of our religious certainty is really just the product of historical accident and power dynamics. This dynamic of political power shaping Christian doctrine reached its apex with the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. Before that point, Christianity had been a persecuted minority religion, often at odds with the Roman state. But Constantine's embrace of the faith transformed it into the official religion of the empire. Suddenly, the theological disputes that had been raging within the church took on much higher stakes. No longer were they just academic debates, they were now battles for power, influence, and the very future of the religion. And with the full coercive force of the state behind them, the pro-Trinitarian faction was able to crush its opponents. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, which affirmed the divinity of Christ, was convened and presided over by Constantine himself. When the Arian faction refused to accept the council's decrees, they were declared heretics and subjected to violent repression. Constantine exiled the Arian bishop Arius and ordered the destruction of his writings. This set the pattern for how future councils and theological debates would be resolved. The emperor would summon the bishops, provide the venue and logistical support, and then back the decisions of the majority with the power of the state. Dissenters were not just refuted, but stripped of their positions, their churches, and sometimes their lives. Though the Trinity, along with other core Christian beliefs, wasn't defined through a free and open exchange of ideas. It was hammered out through a process dominated by political considerations, with the winners enshrining their views as orthodoxy and the losers condemned as heretics. The church was no longer just a spiritual institution. It was now an arm of the state, with all the attendant dynamics of power, patronage, and coercion. This legacy continued to shape the development of Christian theology for centuries. When the eastern and western branches of the church split in the 11th century, it was partly over disagreements about the precise nature of the Trinity and the relationship between the three persons. And later councils like Chalcedon in 451 CE and Trent in the 16th century continued to use state power to enforce their decrees. So the very foundations of Christian belief, which believers often think of as divinely revealed and timeless, were in fact forged through a messy, protracted process of political maneuvering, backed by the threat of force. It's a history that sits uneasily with the common Christian self-impute as a religion of pure spiritual truth, untainted by the grubby realities of worldly power. The influence of this history can still be felt today. Even in the modern era, when church and state are ostensibly separate, debates over Christian doctrine often have an undercurrent of politics and power. Conservative Christians in the United States, for example, have used their political influence to push for the teaching of creationism and intelligent design in public schools, despite the overwhelming scientific consensus against these ideas. Similarly, the Catholic Church's opposition to contraception and same-sex marriage has as much to do with maintaining its institutional power and traditional authority as it does with theology. The Church has often been willing to compromise its principles when political expediency demands it, just as it did in the past. So while the specific issues may have changed, the underlying dynamic remains the same. Christian doctrine is not simply a matter of divine revelation, but an ongoing negotiation shaped by human institutions, vested interests, and power struggles. And this should give us pause when we encounter confident pronouncements about the eternal, unchanging truths of the faith. Ultimately, the story of how Christianity defined its most fundamental tenets is a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious absolutism. When a faith claims to have direct access to absolute truth, it can lead to intolerance, oppression, and the demonization of dissent. The history of Christianity shows how easily such a faith can become entangled with political power, with disastrous consequences. Perhaps a more humble, fallibilistic approach would serve Christianity better, one that acknowledges the human, contingent nature of its development, and is open to ongoing scrutiny, debate, and revision. After all, if the core of the faith took centuries to establish and was shaped by very worldly forces, perhaps we should be more skeptical about claims of eternal, unchanging truth. At the very least, this history should prompt Christians to approach their own beliefs with more nuance and self-awareness. The unquestioning certainty that often characterizes religious discourse may feel comforting, but it risks ignoring the messy realities of how those beliefs were actually forged. A little more humility in the face of this complex history might lead to a richer, more thoughtful faith,